Welcome back to the Daily Nugget, daily property insights, one topic, 20 minutes or less, 7 days a week. Myself, Lawrence Lotze, and today joined by Matt Harris, a property tax specialist and a fellow property investor. And Matt, a question for you today, and it's something I'm seeing, and I know a lot of people around me are asking is, we're going to use an example for this. So first time investors, so your famous mom and pop investors. So I buy my first investment property, or I'm looking to buy my investment property, is do I put that property under my personal name, under a business name, or under a trust?
Really good question. So I spend a lot of time working with first-time investors. And obviously, when you start out as a first-time investor, this is probably the primary question that you want answered.
Yep.
What structure should I use? So there's only three main structures that are utilized by property investors in New Zealand. So one is individual or joint ownership, or a partnership, commonly referred to as tenants in common in relation to a property, but you can have an actual partnership agreement behind it. Then you have a look-through company, or you have a trust. So when I'm dealing with clients, I generally would stay away from individual ownership. And that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, you have no separate legal entity. You have unlimited liability as an individual. And whilst I don't expect that the risk is overly high for property investors, we live in a world now where you have intrinsic risk in property. So you've got Healthy Homes Act now legislation, tenancy legislation. You have meth as a bit of a problem. And then also people forget that you can actually sue in New Zealand now, or you could always sue, but I think it's becoming more common. And then the final part of it is professionalism. So when I think about property investment, I always approach it from a business perspective. Whether you're going to buy one property or 10 properties, if you treat property investment like a business, then you treat it in a professional way, you'll get professional outcomes. So in my mind, not many business owners nowadays would choose to operate under their own name. So that pretty much excludes individual ownership for me. Of course, there's the odd situation where you get someone who used to own a house that they lived in, and then they've moved and bought a new house. We may not restructure that, but it would be on the cards. So if we look at look-through company and trust, this is a really interesting one. Look-through companies in really wide use in New Zealand, effectively an ordinary closed company with a tax election, which makes it transparent. So in that respect, profits and losses flow out to the individuals. And the reason that we use a look-through company as opposed to a closed company is that capital gains can be distributed from a look-through company really easy. And we assume that our investors are long-term buy and hold investors, and therefore they're going to hold long enough to be outside Brightline, which is probably something we'd have to discuss in another episode. And therefore they're going to have a capital gain. The practical problem with a closed company is that if you have multiple properties in that closed company and you just want the gain from one property, you have to shift those properties out and wind up. LTC gets out of that. So LTCs in wide use. Traditionally, they were used for negatively geared properties, and they were set up so that the shareholding flowed those losses to the highest shareholder. We then had ring fencing introduced. You can no longer offset rental property losses against other types of income. So that happened first. And then obviously after that, we had record low interest rates. So a lot of the negativity disappeared out of these portfolios, and those LTCs, unfortunately, are now set up the wrong way. 90% of the income is going to the high earner, and it should be going to the low earner. So the downside of a look-through company is they're not flexible in any way at all. You cannot change the shareholding during the Brightline period. Because you'll trigger Brightline. Then outside of that, if the only reason that you're changing the shareholding is to get a tax advantage, well, whilst Inland Revenue is probably not going to look at that, that is low-level tax evasion or avoidance, actually. So look-through companies are still really good structures. They work really well. We've got a stable situation, two earners earning about the same amount, or one high earner, one low earner. Not much is going to change for a 5 to 8 year period. Now, interestingly enough, we have one other thing to consider, and that is, are you going to be buying a new build property, or are you going to be buying an in situ property? If you're going to be buying a new build, LTC all the way. The cash flow profile from a new build is typically low. They are growth assets. Therefore, we expect them to be slightly negative, slightly positive, or neutral, depending on interest rates and obviously the amount of deposit or leverage. If you're buying an in situ property now, by default, you are not going to get an interest deduction. So what happens in those circumstances is that the net income for tax purposes of the portfolio is going to increase significantly. If you have something like a look-through company, that income is going to flow into your own name, and we're going to start to see people who get bracket creep. So they might earn $40,000 and suddenly they've got 30 grand on top. They're getting taxed at 33%, or maybe the high earners, they're earning 160,000. Suddenly they've got 30 grand on top and they're in the 180,000, 39% tax bracket. So now we have to ask that question, in situ's new builds or mix. It might be that a trust structure is better, and trusts are also widely used in New Zealand. And we've just had a new Trust Act come into force at the start of the year. Part of the research that the government did said there was a trust for 1 in 12 New Zealanders, which is a huge amount. But in short, it was a really, really well-received act. The commentary as it went through Parliament was really positive, and they pretty much rubber-stamped the use of trusts in New Zealand for another 50 years. Where trusts have excelled in the last sort of year or so is that trusts are, first of all, a very great asset protection vehicle, but they're highly flexible. In a trust structure, you can either retain income at the trustee level, and you pay a maximum tax rate of 33%, which is obviously different to the 39% tax rate. Or you can go down to the beneficiaries and they will pay at their marginal tax rate. So it could be your wife who's earning less, or family members, any other reason to distribute some income to those people, you can get a lower tax rate. So if you're buying in situ properties, you protect yourself from bracket creep. Or if you've got a high cash flow profile from the properties, they are more tax effective. They're also more commonly used by business owners who are subject to risk. So, the caveat on them is that it's all things taxation based. When there is a differential in tax rates, which to give some quick context for the viewers, New Zealand has what's called a broad-based low-rate tax system, or we used to have it, and that pretty much means that everything's kind of taxed along the same level, or the tax rates are close together. Now we're back into the old days when the top tax rate is higher than the structure rate. So that what that does is opens the door for people to use structures to minimize tax. And for the record, totally legitimate thing to do if you do it the right way. So diverting passive income streams into a trust, I think, totally valid. Rents, interest, dividends. But if you try and divert active income streams, so business income streams to a certain point, salary and wage, things like that, you're going to get in a bit of trouble. To illustrate the government's got their eye on this is that we now have new disclosure requirements coming into effect for trusts. So every time you file a tax return for a trust, you're going to have to provide information of the balance sheet and some other things for the IRD to have a look at in terms of where that income's come from. So in short, there is no one structure that fits everyone. We always have a bit of discussion, but if I was going to summarize it, I think if you buy new builds and you're a first-time investor, quite commonly we'd look to use an LTC for the first 5 to 8 years of your investing journey. If you are an advanced investor, high cash flow, or you're a high earner, or a business owner, then it probably is going to be, or buying in situ properties, it might be leaning more towards a trust structure.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Matt. Yeah, and I guess it's just a lot of things depending on your situation, which one you go with. Also, I'm assuming, Matt, if you're in one of those and you go, oh, I should be on the other side, you can shift. Now, again, this is where a bit of a challenge comes. We've got obviously the bright line, which we've covered off before. Some of that might be triggered. So if you shift from personal name into trust, you've actually got to, in theory, sell it from one side to the other. So it can trigger some of these new laws and things like that. So it doesn't make it as easy to shift along the different process.
No, and traditionally restructuring was a lot easier than it is now. And it's not in theory, actually have to sell the property and transfer it and get a new mortgage. However, in the new rules, they have enacted some rollover relief, which means that you can change structures in certain circumstances and not trigger bright line. So, if talk to your advisor if you're looking at that. From April next year, rollover relief is available. Having said that, when we look at structures, we generally try to set them up for that 5 to 8 year period if possible. But things change. People's lives change.
Yep, totally. And thanks to that, Matt, as always. And to anyone else that has any further questions about today's show or any other future topics you'd like to cover, just find the details in the descriptions below, or just leave a comment as well. And thanks for coming over to the Daily Nugget, Daily Property Insights, one topic, 20 minutes or less, 7 days a week. And as always, hope to see you tomorrow.